What we should do is to see plain English as the opposite of obscure, convoluted English. In other words, it's English being used well, but it is English being used with full consideration of the audience.
The reason behind plain English as a movement was essentially to take account of the interests and the needs of the reader, not the writer so much, but the interests and needs of, and the capacities of the reader.
Well, one of the greatest causes of hardship in the community is that a lot of people don't find out about their rights, or if they do find out about them, don't know how to apply for them, or just can't cope with the forms and the communication that's involved. So a lot of the hardship that I've found, people who can't get social security payments, can't get help to find a job, comes from the fact that the communication to them is just not good enough.
I mean, it seems crazy to me that we, spend a lot of time teaching people to read, and then society, whether it's governments or organisations, present them with stuff that is basically unreadable. And not just for people who have trouble reading, but for most of us. And it's just bad communication.
Major blockages from stopping them from occurring is the way in which people think about communication as if it was a very simple process of writing a letter and putting it into an envelope and sending it to somebody else. And that it is an unproblematic process. It's a process that can actually go right most of the time, when in fact it's the exact reverse. It's a process that typically goes wrong.
We've often been encouraged to believe that we have to use, as you called it, Sunday English, a special type of language when we come to write. This has partly arisen because so much of the writing we've looked at in the past has been great literature. But of course, great writers are using language for the sheer pleasure in the language. A piece of literature is a piece of art. And here the writer is using the language to draw attention to itself, to create, a piece of beauty. Whereas a lot of writing that we do has a different purpose. It's to provide information quickly to people, to make requests of people. So it's, if you like, a functional form of language. Now, the language shouldn't be drawing attention to itself. Our concentration should be on the message and helping the reader get that message as quickly as possible.
I think it's a lot of the idea of perhaps the way that we were taught to write formally. You may talk to your students in one way, you may teach in a very practical way, but when you write it's different. You've got to be more formal. And I've worked with a lot of teachers and they'll say one thing and write something completely different down. And you say, but you wouldn't say that. No, I wouldn't say that to the students because they'd all fall about laughing if I talked like that. But I'm writing for the same students and I write like that. And they say, but that's how writing is. It's perhaps, I don't know, in our generation, the formal way we were taught to write. Like don't use got and don't use don't. You should use do not. And all those, I guess, grammar rules perhaps, and focusing more on the mechanics of the writing than is it getting the message across. Where now I think communication is the big issue. And people are starting to look at, well, if it doesn't communicate from you to me,
It is impossible for communication and more particularly language to be unambiguous. Okay? There is no certainty in the words we use. So the communication process is problem-laden, but it's also great fun at the same time. So that if we had this terribly neat, precise, unambiguous so-called language, it actually wouldn't be a language, because one of the characteristics of language is that it's open-ended, it's infinite, and it has the potential for a great deal of creative activity to cope with new situations.
We've looked upon writing as being essentially a language task and essentially choosing fanciful language. And we haven't seen our documents as documents of communication. We haven't seen them as documents that are serving particular functions and being satisfied that if they've served that function, if they got the answer we wanted, if we got the person to do what we wanted them to do, then that's all we need require of those documents. And especially if we can get the person to do what we want them to do or to follow through a set of instructions with the least amount of difficulty, the least amount of pain for the readers, then we've been successful.
If you don't care about your readers, then really, and if that's not part of the driving passion of what you're doing, then you really shouldn't be in the business of writing anything for anyone anyway. The reader has to be taken account of. I think that's the first thing, and that's a motivational thing. In other words, that's a basic thing. If you've got that, then you can learn the technical skills that are needed.
And I think the first thing you ought to get clear about is why. Why are you writing this particular document? Now, that may sound quite strange, but very often people don't sort out their purpose of writing the document, and as a result they put in a lot of irrelevant material. Very often when we set out writing about a subject, we're still clarifying it in our own minds. So the first thing is to recognise that we should work through several drafts. The first draft is for us. We're writing for ourselves. And then having got that sorted out, then we can turn around and think about our audience, and we start writing for the audience. In other words, we turn it from being oriented to the writer to being oriented to the reader.
Now, if you get somebody having an argument about the logical structure of a document, and somebody's saying, no, logically that's got to go in this order, no, this is the logic, right? And this, and you know, it goes on and on and on and on. You can go on till the cows come home with that sort of an argument, because there is no basis on which it can be clarified other than through the power struggle. And that's the wrong pathway for working out the meaning. You go to the people and ask them, the people who are going to be using the document. One way of putting the proof, as it were, before people's eyes is to take them along and say, watch this person trying to fill out a form, or watch this person trying to make sense of this document. For a lot of people who haven't got, 100% vested interest in their words, they find that a very powerful demonstration. And they walk away and they say, my God, it is horrible, isn't it?
This is a TAFE college. These TAFE teachers have decided to use a plain English approach to the writing of teaching notes for panel beaters.
It started off originally with problems with students who had reading problems. They said these students can't read the current materials, so they need plain English notes. But what's happened is that we've moved from that to writing these notes for all students, because all students are being disadvantaged by the sorts of materials that are being given.
Before I used to give them reams of notes on the board, and they got it down, and I thought they understood, but I didn't really know till the exam came around.
They're guys who've gone through school because of various problems, always haven't done well. They can read and write in a fashion. Some of them can't read very well at all. They can usually write in a fashion, but not read very well. They can be a good copier.
And it was picked up because a lot of students were needing readers for final exams, and then the industry body said they can't have that. If they're going to be qualified panel beaters, they need to be able to read and write the stuff.
They've been collaborating for 2 years now. We wanted to see how the process has been working.
When you're removing or refitting an air conditioning system, there are safety rules you must follow.
You don't like that anyway.
No.
Well, I think you better to
points.
start. No, but I think you better to start and tell them that what could happen to them, because they mostly ignore safety rules anyway. I mean, you can say, oh, these are the rules, that's what you should follow, and think, oh yeah, I'll take notes. If you say, when you're removing or refitting an air conditioning system, it's very dangerous and this could happen to you. Therefore, you need to.
If the system isn't damaged, so I'm going to have to start again, but that the system is fully pressurised, if it's not damaged, so that's when the danger occurs. If it's been damaged, the gas probably would have gone.
Somebody said to us that you must have to hang your ego up at the door before you sit down and write, and I think it's very true. And that's very difficult to do, because if you criticise somebody's writing, people think you're criticising them, and it's separating what we're writing from you. Like, I get on really well with you, but I don't like what you've written. I find we have to use a lot of humour to get around situations, and I guess we've worked together for quite a while, but it's very stressful sometimes.
The first thing I've had to do is learn that I've got to take what I've used for years and look at it pretty critically and criticise what I do. It's not just simply a matter of sitting down and taking an existing bit of text and writing it into plain English. It'd be almost like trying to give something to Greg and say, here, plain English this. It doesn't work, because you've got to sit down and discuss it and actually look at what you're doing. Look at the syllabus at times, because the syllabus is not all that plain. Look at the material that you've got. Get it all together in some format that makes sense, write it all up, and then criticise it, pull it to bits and start again. It's not a real simple process.
So you're working
So
on the
so that's the front.
compressor. Yep.
Here's the front, bumper, right?
Right all over
This way in the car.
Start that way and go again. Sorry. Right.
And that's the condenser back here.
No, hang on. That diagram.
I
I'll
don't
start
think that's
again.
a dreadfully helpful diagram if you don't already know it, is it? I used to be a bit nicer about the material and say, oh, it's just written in a different style, but I'm going to write it in plain English. And now I say, that's just dreadfully written, because it doesn't communicate.
I can't help it now. I pick up something and I just have a little browse. Have a look at that. What the hell do they mean?
A colleague of mine went out and actually talked to students. The classic thing people tend to do is give them a survey. You know, like tick the box. You know, rate these notes from 1 to 5. You know, that's it. We've done a survey. We know, you know. And we feel that doesn't work. And so somebody went out and actually talked to the students in a very open-ended sort of way and said things like, how do you use the notes? Because there is no point us writing stuff and it comes out in a lovely book and it's in beautiful plain English and we sit back and the students don't use it. It's a waste of everybody's money. It started for me when I first came to TAFE. I had students come to me who weren't coping with their theory. I said, let's look at your notes you've got from the teacher or the notes in your textbook. And the problem was the textbook, not the students. So it's much more cost effective for people like Mari and I to work at the notes so that all students get that benefit, rather than, here are these dreadful notes, you failed.
It's easier to quickly write a newsletter at another time.
This is an inner-city primary school. As a matter of course, teachers communicate with parents through writing. We asked these teachers whether they thought the school newsletter was communicating what they wanted it to.
I've often had parents say to me, especially with the newsletter on Friday afternoon, that if it's more than a page, it's a problem to read. So if it's not going to be read if there are 2 pages, then you have to keep to 1, and that means you have to carefully sift which bits will have to be left out.
When you're thinking it's a formal type of letter to parents, you tend to think back to how do you write a good essay type of thing, and then you get caught up in all that.
You're dealing with parents who all have their own personal views of teachers or education or the school or their child or whatever, so I think you have to be very careful about what you say.
I think you do too. Well, I'd be very careful in some letters because of feedback I've got at other times about annoyance, about what was considered an improper form.
I think that this is probably the part of our concern, that we need to maintain a professional image that is being put across to parents in the way we communicate, but trying to do that within a way that's for them a very clear message that we're giving to them. So therein lies at the moment, I think, some of the conflict that we're feeling.
So if we send home a lot of personal language when they're expecting their children to be taught as they were taught, perhaps in essay writing form, I think until the general community attitude changes, it's harder for schools.
I think there are times when we have to look at presenting people with a piece of writing that is more, I suppose, more within professional boundaries.
Should this be an example of professional writing, sort of an elevated style of writing, or what's your purpose?
Anything that a teacher puts in print is, there is some sort of legality attached to it. I mean, we have a responsibility to all these parents' children, and I think we have to be fairly professional with the way we write things, because we could possibly be legally responsible for anything that we put down in print. Maybe that's a better way of putting it.
Working in groups, the teachers were asked to assess the letter for content, sequence of information and layout, and then report back.
The heading needed to be more concise, something like Winter Sport 1990. We were concerned with the phrase a rotational program that wasn't clear enough, that the sports and their locations needed to be in a table, and we started to talk about the paragraph that deals with cost, and we were concerned that that wasn't quite clear, but that's as far as we got.
We acknowledge that this particular example was written in a time limit, and that because now we had time to go over it, we looked at it more carefully, and agree with you that there were areas to alter, including the rotational program section that we would have altered, and also we thought, again, as you did, that it is envisaged. Or there was some discussion about the word envisaged, but majority ruled, and we decided we liked it, and so therefore we'd use it. And, all right, so, but we might use it, rearrange the sentence to look at the structure of it.
That's right. Trying to talk people into voting yes without giving them too much information in case they don't get quite what they think they're going to.
Yeah, held to it in a couple of months' time. But you said that they were going to be able to do
yes,
tennis.
It will be very good. That's what we're really trying to say.
People all over the world are reassessing their communications. The NRMA are famous for their plain English policies. Now they have engaged David Sless to improve their contracts and forms.
There was a major change in the legislation that governed insurance contracts a few years ago, and it caused us to have a complete rethink after that had been implemented. It had caused us to become somewhat less than plain in our English, and that was making life more difficult both for us, our customers, and ultimately we felt that we should turn the wheel one more time. And that's where we are today.
The problem with a lot of public documents, whether they're in the public or private sector, it doesn't matter, but just documents used publicly, is when you, the number of inquiries on your telephone start to build up and build up and build up, right? I've just got your insurance policy form. I don't understand this. Can you explain it to me? I've just got your, brochure on home insurance. I've just got your brochure on social security. What do you mean by this? Okay. When you start to get increasing number of calls, such as your switchboard is jammed full all day, you know you've got a problem. The other way that you know that you've got problems, particularly with forms, is that people either do not fill out questions in the form, or they give you what you know reasonably well is wrong information. It's been put in the wrong place, or you couldn't possibly be 181 years of age, so you've obviously got your birth date wrong, etc., etc. So it's the errors, both of omission and commission, as it were, that occur on the form. If they start increasing, you quite clearly have got a badly working document of some sort or another. Now, in a very simple sense, those errors cost money. Now, in either the public or the private sector, for no other reason, there's a very good economic motive for having good quality, comprehensible and usable documents, because it reduces errors, it reduces counter staff inquiries, it reduces telephone inquiries, and it reduces repairing all of the mistakes that have been made. In other words, you cut your staff processing time in various ways quite substantially when you improve your documents, and of course that saves you money.
Plain English to us is a matter of course. So really what we were looking at is an extension of the principle to move onwards. We'd had a quality program go through the company, and the concept of, you know, turning the wheel, making the next step, small improvements one after another, had become very familiar to the people in this organisation. We became customer driven. That was the key. You know, Plain English was aimed at the customer and didn't really have much other part to play in the process of insurance. And yeah, these people certainly said, well, you know, you've got to manage your information, and the best way to do that is by starting right at the beginning of the process. The beginning of the process is the customer. Interestingly though, the customers are not just the customers that walk through the front door. Everyone has a vested interest in these forms, and you know, they're all customers, internal, external, whatever you want to call them. There's no point getting it right for the customer if you mess it up for everyone else within the NRMA who has to use the damn thing every day of the week.
In an ideal situation, of course, what you want is a document that matches the way your user of the document thinks, rather than the bureaucracy and how that thinks. You have to test very carefully with the users of the document whether they can actually understand it or not.
Can I ask you question 17?
Number of cylinders.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have a clue.
Okay.
Sorry. Or the engine size.
What would you do if you actually completed this form for car insurance?
Cylinders. I'll probably ask my husband, I suppose.
Okay. They get frustrated. They sort of think this form's not well designed. And it's also not only the form, but it reflects on the organisation and all the other procedures that go with it. They sort of get a bit worried, sort of think, oh, you know, go through the form, oh, idiots, you know, and so on.
Testing makes the whole thing sound very scientific. We're dealing with something very human. We're dealing with what I've described as a conversation, and there's nothing scientific about a conversation. An enormous amount of it, though, is a sensitivity to what people are actually saying to you when they talk to you about documents.
What sort of things does the RMA want to know about in that section? When they refer to, down here, driving an insurance record.
If they've got a bad record, they'd be a high risk, wouldn't they, for the insurance company?
What do they mean by bad record? What would...
Maybe traffic offences, or they've had claims through other insurance companies.
Observation of what people do is actually very important. In fact, sometimes it is much better to observe just a few people filling out a document than it is to collect hundreds of reports, of accounts that people will give you of what a document was like. Really, it's a much richer source of information.
The better the document in terms of reducing error, at least so far with what we've been doing, it's a more moral document, I suppose, is a way of saying it at the same time. Or it's a document that addresses issues of equity of information, at least. That people are understanding and are able to make sense of what is required for them, and therefore can make more appropriate and reasonable choices, particularly if it's in terms of engaging in an act or requesting a benefit or getting an insurance contract or whatever. So far, at least with what we've been doing, we have been able to establish an extraordinarily clear relationship between improving equitable relationships and saving money.
We developed a number of measures for the performance of our forms. We measured our current forms. We've stored the measurements. We'll be doing exactly the same measurements on the new forms after they've bedded down into our network. At that time, we believe we'll be able to make some very good quantitative estimates of the savings, i.e. the dollars that are going to flow back to the organisation. I think there's no doubt that we'll recover all our costs within 1 year of operation, and as a payback period, that's probably the best one I've ever seen in anything that the NRMA's done. And we're not talking about $4,000 or $5,000 worth of investment. You know, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. We expect to get that back in a year. We expect to continue getting that back for years to come. And we expect to improve on it because we really believe that over time we'll improve on the performance of those forms. So, you know, we're talking lots of money. And I think at the end of the day, the only winners are the NRMA's customers.
In government, as in the private sector, people are trying to improve their communication and to make forms and government more user-friendly. Professor Robert Eagleson has undertaken to remake a workers' compensation claim form for the State Rail Authority.
It's one thing to write a document in the quietness of your own office, but you don't know the audience, you don't know the problems they're facing, so the only way to find that out is to come and let a group, a representative group, have a look at it, try to fill it in, and then you find out whether it's going to succeed or not.
If you just fill out this section and then try and move on to part C about what actually happened to him to cause the injury.
The first step that I like to do in a test is to leave them alone and just step back and watch them, because it's where a person pauses or where they turn to look to one of their colleagues that you realise there's a problem. Now, very often a person will blame themselves. They think that they haven't understood or they haven't been as bright as they should have been, and they won't blame the form. A public servant will work 100,000 minutes a year. If you have a form, 100,000 copies being filled in, if you can save 1 minute in processing that form, then that's one employee that you can redirect to more productive work.
The effectiveness of services relies on people knowing about them, first of all, and then being able to actually use the service, and that means that you're relying very heavily on plain information and good service when you actually have a query.
And a couple of matters came up from there which we're still...
The telephone bill is the face of telecom to most of us. To help improve the efficiency of their service and their relationship with their customers, Telecom has set up a Consumers Council to improve the clarity of the bills.
Phrases such as total amount payable could easily be changed to you owe Telecom, and we received on the top column could be changed to you paid. I think that's much simpler for somebody with those sorts of difficulties. Other issues that I'll just quickly draw attention to, I think you'll get 5 million calls from people saying, what's a unit? Where you say 370 units. I think it's quite unclear to people what that actually means.
That does present us with a problem, and we've had a lot of many midnight hours trying to determine what's an appropriate term to go there. Because while we integrate the STD and local call charges, and there are also other charges on there as well, it's very difficult to get a term that embraces all of that and keeps it clear. So we're certainly open to suggestions on that.
Communication is one of the ways in which people exercise power over other people. Now, those relationships are there all the time. Just by turning something into plain English, you don't necessarily get rid of those relationships. So that there are always issues to do with negotiating power when you're dealing with issues of language.
You can't separate language use from power. In the very act of talking with somebody else, or with writing to somebody else, or whatever it is you're doing as a part of the communication process, you're actually trying to establish a relationship with the other person at the same time. I can say the content of something. I could say, I really wish you wouldn't smoke here, compared with, don't you bloody all light that cigarette, right? basically the same intent, is to stop you from smoking, but the relationship that I'm trying to define with a very gentle form versus the other one is quite different. Yes, there are vested interests, and very important vested interests, because it goes hand in hand with the way in which we do engage in communication with people. We engage in communication with people in certain types of relationships that we are actively and continually trying to define and negotiate.
Plain English says there are limits to access, there are disadvantages. Let's see what we can do about them. I think that's an absolutely necessary starting point. The moment you probe, and I think people who are engaged in the program of Plain English probe a lot, you see that the differences exist because there are differences of power, which relate to differences of knowledge or other kinds of courses for difference of power. And then you have to probe, you know, to what extent can we give access to that kind of power to this group of clients, this group of people? Do they need it? Do they want it? How can it change?
You can never say, for example, in an area like this, oh, it would have worked but for the internal politics. To say that is really to be naive. You have to deal with the internal politics because they're a normal part of what is going on. So you have to make allowance for that.
In terms of trying to change a form or a public document or any of the interfaces between the organisation and the public, you end up finding that what a lot of people in the organisation think, oh, that's just a simple form, that it's the key to everything, and it's also the key to the biggest, you know, can of worms that you can ever see sometimes. And if the senior management, and by senior I mean very top, are not in support of this, then the power politics, as we've already linked this notion with language and its uses, comes into play in the most wonderfully exciting but difficult ways.